Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had a chance to check out our sponsor and exhibitor booths and had the opportunity to meet with and talk with representatives from Pondera Health Solutions. It's now my pleasure to welcome Jennifer Kuhn, President and CEO of Empire Blue Cross Blue Shield New York's Medicaid plan. She's going to introduce and moderate today's discussion for our next panel, State Efforts to Curb Prescription Drug Costs. I'll now turn it over to Jennifer. Good morning, Jennifer.
Good morning. This is Jennifer Kuhn, and I'm happy to be with everyone. The host has turned my camera off, so I'm going to hopefully be joining you in a second. There you go.
There you go. There you are.
There I am. There. So it's a pleasure for me to moderate this next panel. We're going to be talking about the growth of prescription drug spending, which I know is a concern for lots of constituents. And we're actually going to start our panel today with a presentation from Joel Menges, who's the CEO of the Menges Group, and he'll include an overview of his recent report examining New York's proposal to carve the pharmacy benefit out of the Medicaid managed care program. Joel has led hundreds of consulting engagements that have involved the design, development, improvement, and evaluation of coordinated care programs, including Medicaid initiatives in 40 other states, as well as DC and Puerto Rico. He's worked extensively for Medicaid agencies and other state clients, health plans, and national and state trade associations that play a significant role in the design of coordinated care programs at the state. So thank you, Joel, for joining us today. Our panel is going to be consisting of several different members. The first is Assembly Member Daniel Rosenthal, who congratulations on your re-election campaign. Assemblymember Rosenthal was assumed office to serve New York's 27th Assembly District in 2017. He's a resident of Queens and represents the constituents of Kew Gardens, Kew Garden Hills, Pamonk, Elecchester, College Point, and parts of Whitestone, Richmond Hill, Briarwood, and Forest Hills. As a public servant to the Queen County residents, starting in 2011, he has served alongside Councilman Rory Landsman of Queens, first as the councilman's aide and then to the position of district director. Some of his legislative priorities includes keeping Queens affordable, supporting small businesses, standing against the injustices within our public housing system, and ensuring all residents has access to essential services. He is also on chair of a subcommittee on intergenerational care, and Assemblyman Rosenthal continues to put community residents' interests at the forefront of his priorities. In addition, we'll have Beth Finkel, who's part of the New York State Director for AARP. Beth leads the day-to-day operations of AARP New York, advocating for New York's 50-plus population, which I guess I have to consider myself a constituent. During her tenure as state director, AARP's lobbying efforts have led to historic reforms, including the passage of the Secure Choice Savings Program, CARE Act, assisted living protections, anti-predatory lending, paid family leave and affordable housing, and rights to counsel in New York City's legislations, and numerous bills on kin care. Prior to her work as the state director, Beth was the director of engagement of AARP, where she was responsible for all community programs and activities that serves the organization's membership and engage its vast network of over 5,000 active volunteers in the state of New York. And then last but not least, I'd like to also introduce Trish Riley, who's the executive director for the National Academy for State Health Policy. Trish Riley is the executive director of the National Academy for State Health Policy and president of its corporate board. She helped establish and build this organization starting in 1988 through 2003. Prior, she was a distinguished fellow in the state health policy at George Washington University and taught in graduate programs at the Muskogee School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine. In the early 2000s, she served as the director of the Governor's Office of Health Policy and Finance, leading efforts to develop a comprehensive, coordinated health system in Maine, including access to affordable health insurance. She was the principal architect of the Dorigo Health Reform and served as the state's liaison to the federal government and Congress. So this is quite a distinguished panel and look forward to our discussion. So now I'm going to turn it over to Joel to walk through his presentation, and then we will moderate the panel on some questions and answers. So with that, Joel, I'm going to hand it over to you and also share your presentation.
Hey, thank you, Jennifer. And sorry to turn the CEO of an enormous company into a slide flipper for me, but big resume padding opportunity for you, right? And thanks, Eric, and the association, and to all the participants for having me. I live in kind of a Medicaid bubble, and so I'm going to speak to Medicaid prescription drug dynamics over the past decade, and what we've seen from a data point of view and a policy point of view. Next slide, please. The focus of what I'm going to speak to is driven by some excellent data that CMS makes available and that we work with. We have 2 staff who do nothing but work with this data, but it's 100% sample of Medicaid's prescription drug data, and it differentiates the claims that MCOs pay from fee-for-service, and it goes back into the 1990s. It's quarterly, it's at the NDC level, so it's a wonderful 100% sample of what's going on in the Medicaid prescription drug arena. And we also, through a separate CMS database, can see the rebates, the statutory rebates, and most of the supplemental negotiated rebates that are paid. So we can kind of look, and we know which states have had which approaches between carve-ins and carve-outs, and when they moved, and then if they have uniform PDLs and so forth. So there's a real good opportunity analytically to look at what's working well and what isn't, and that's going to be the focus of what we present. Next slide, please. This is outside the pharmacy bubble. This is just sort of conveying the degree to which Medicaid managed care has sort of become dominant in the Medicaid arena from a national lens. In fiscal year over the past decade, in 2010, capitation to the MCOs was about 1/5 of Medicaid spend, and fee-for-service was 71%. So about 52 percentage points bigger slice of the overall pie was fee-for-service just 10 years ago. As of 2019, that had flipped to capitation being 7 percentage points higher than fee-for-service. And there's also a sliver of 8 or so percentage points that's special funding arrangements that aren't really tied to a specific beneficiary's care, the DISH and the supplemental payments and so forth. But Medicaid managed care is now where states are predominantly turning, and it makes a lot of sense. I think through my career, I've seen Medicaid turn. The fee-for-service setting takes a Medicaid card to the beneficiary and says, go use it, and going and using it is difficult because of the access barriers they face, and because of the delivery system barriers in terms of people not taking that card. And then it says to the providers, kind of do whatever you want, and the taxpayer will just pay for whatever happens to happen. And from neither a cost nor a quality or access perspective, is that good enough? And we've driven ourselves towards a system of coverage and care where we're really trying to facilitate access and manage out excess costs and so forth. And you'll see on the pharmacy side what's happened there in the MCO arena. I'll go to the next slide. I want to kind of move through this because the panel's so strong, so I don't want to spend too much time with my opening presentation here. But this is the pharmacy, the Medicaid prescription drug side of the same story I just showed on the previous slide, which is the degree to which states are relying on MCOs to manage the drug benefit has skyrocketed over the past decade. 22% of Medicaid's prescriptions were paid by MCOs in 2011. That's now over 70%. And the data on what's happened with that transition is most of what I'm going to speak to next. But a huge embracement of the MCOs managing the benefit, and a huge data laboratory for all of us analytical folks to look at here. Next slide, please. So one policy approach that some states have taken with their Medicaid drug benefit is to require all their Medicaid MCOs to use the same preferred drug list, the same formulary, so to speak. So Florida and Texas are two states that have done that sort of the longest and strongest, if you will, in terms of real large states using that model. And I would describe what they've done and what most states have done when they use this model is sort of a top down. The state determines what drugs will be on the PDL, and they're seeking, uniformity so they can maximize the rebates on the brand drugs. And they dictate that to the MCOs, and the MCOs have to use those PDLs. There's a second way to do it, which Michigan has adopted, which says all the MCOs will use the same PDL, but the MCOs themselves come together and try to sort out what the most clinically effective and cost-effective PDL content should be. Just a quick summary of how that has worked out is Michigan, with its MCO-driven PDL, uniform PDL, ranks 6th in the nation right now in terms of having the 6th lowest net cost per prescription. And I will say net cost per prescription is a wonderful statistical benchmark to assess states' performance in managing the drug benefit. That includes the mix of drugs at the front end, what you're paying for the drugs at the front end, the mix of drugs within brands, within generics, between brands and generics, the fill fees you're paying, all of that is at the front end. And then all the rebates that get netted against that, both the statutory ACA rebates and the negotiated rebates get credited against that. And then at the end of, with all of that in the cake, you can divide the costs you have left by the number of prescriptions. And that net cost per prescription, I think, is a very powerful statistic when you have 100% of the data to work with. And Texas ranks 32nd in the nation, 32nd highest cost, and Florida ranks 39th. And these are both states that have over 95% of their prescriptions paid by MCOs. So from the point of view of the way MCOs are typically managing the benefit, they should be doing better than that. Michigan, with its uniform, with its health plan driven PDL, is ranked 6th. And they're much more in line with what we normally see MCOs achieving when they're able to use their tools. But when the tools are sort of taken away from them, as Texas and Florida have done, this model becomes much less cost effective. Next slide, please. This is just a 5-year comparison of how Medicaid MCOs have done on that same statistic I described, the net cost per prescription, how the Medicaid fee-for-service setting has done, how Medicaid has done overall, and how the MCOs look as a percent of the fee-for-service cost per prescription. And year in and year out, the MCOs are achieving roughly 25 to 30% lower net cost per prescription than fee-for-service. It's an incredibly large sum of money that's being saved there versus relying on the fee-for-service setting. And again, everything's in the cake, the rebates and the initial payment structure and amounts and so forth. So to be that many percentage points better is a monumental thing fiscally. Next slide, please. And this is the last one. This one thing that we have that's emerged in New York and a few other states is a move to carve out the drug benefit. And we've been asked in several states, including by the New York's Health Plan Association, to look at what that might achieve or fail to achieve. And a key way that we've tried to come at this is there were 13 states who used a carve-out model in 2011, and most of those states moved to a carve-in, and we can see what happened between 2011 and 2019 when those states, New York being one of them, moved to a carve-in model. And we can see what the 3 states, Missouri, Tennessee, and Wisconsin, what's happened in those states who have retained their carve-out approach throughout the past decade. And the states that collectively across the states that moved to a carve-in model, their cost per prescription in 2019 were literally lower in the face of all that's gone on to push drug costs up, and new drugs like Hep C drugs and everything else that happens. The net cost per prescription is actually lower across all of those states in 2019 than it was in 2011. In the states that kept their carve out, their cost per prescription collectively are 18 percentage points higher. So there's roughly a 20% difference there. I feel that that's understating the true difference because there's still some fee-for-service prescriptions in the carve-in states and some other things. But you can also see, a key driver in this on the right-hand side of this table is it's the mix of drugs. It's the most important factor that's yielding the savings that the MCO model is achieving, the carve-in model is achieving. The degree to which the generic percentage has shot up, 17 percentage points from the states when they moved from a carve-out to a carve-in, versus an 8% increase. Drugs are going off patent everywhere, so everybody's typically moving up in the generic percentage. But the health plans are really managing the mix towards the lowest cost drug well, and that's the driver in the numbers that I'm speaking to. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Jennifer, and to the panel.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing and bring the panel up. And I have a couple of developed questions. And then for those in the audience who may want to send something in through the question and answers tab, we'll get to that after these. So the first questions I'm going to tee up to Assemblyman Rosenthal and Beth. So Joel's presentation outlined several challenges I think that everybody's facing in pharmaceutical trend and the impact that it has specifically on state Medicaid programs. Can each of you provide some insight into how rising prescription costs actually affects the true constituent, the member at the end, and the ones that you represent? So I'll start first with you, Dan, and perhaps talk about the constituents in your market.
Yeah, I mean, we see it all the time. Those who suffer the most from these rising costs are those on fixed incomes. And we've had several instances where, a constituent would actually be on the same medication for a long period of time. And then one day they were checking their bills and all of a sudden it shot up to a significant amount. And they would ask us to call the Medicaid offices to see if we could advocate on their behalf. And sometimes simply wasn't affordable, and they would end up calling their doctor again to see if there was a similar medication that they could use and get at a lesser price, and would actually require them to switch some of their medications. So we see that we have a lot of, especially when it comes to seniors on fixed incomes, who every single cent and penny is really calculated every month. And when there is a monthly one of their monthly prescriptions that goes up a significant jump, that money has to come from somewhere, and they have to make some serious decisions about their own personal health care because of that rise in cost.
Thank you. So Beth, representing seniors who are advocates and consumers themselves for prescription drugs, a little bit about their perspective.
I've got to echo what the assembly member said. People are really struggling, and I can give you some data just to really illustrate how bad this is. In 2017, 20% of New York State residents stopped taking medications due to the cost. 20%. It's a scary number. And again, all this is pre-COVID, so we can only imagine after, right? The average annual cost of prescription drug treatment increased 57% between 2012 and 2017, while the annual income for New Yorkers only increased 11%, 11.5% actually. So 57% increase, and income only went up 11.5%. So it's pretty hard to keep up, right? And then in 2018, the retail price for 267 widely used brand name prescription drugs increased by 5.8%. And when you contrast that with the general inflation rate, which was 2.4%, again, that is more than double over the same period. I can keep going on and on. it exceeded the general inflation rate by twofold to more than 100-fold. 100-fold. Literally, you see my jaw dropping as I say this because it really is staggering. And then we'll give you one more, but I've got more, but I'll save you. The annual cost of brand name drugs in 2006 was $1,800, $1,868. 2018, it was $7,202. Those are the trend lines, and they're pretty awful. And the average person will have to dig into their pocket. You can understand why people are making unfortunate decisions between taking their medication or taking part of their medication, because in these times they've got to put food on the table and pay their rent, etc. It's scary.
Thanks, Beth. Those are, staggering numbers and probably the reality for all of us. I'm going to actually turn to Trish, and as we think about policy and what other states have similar challenges in managing and increasing pharmaceutical spend. What are some approaches that other states may have taken to address this issue of rising drug costs in either their Medicaid program or any public marketplace, and the changes in new drugs coming into the market and consumer demand? How do you balance good policy with good clinical practice?
Good question. Well, Joel did a great job on the MCO side. I would say there is continued interest in carving out the pharmacy benefit from MCOs. West Virginia's experience, Ohio's experience, considerable savings. California's proposal, of course, a very large state, proposing to carve out. And I think the key point to those carve-outs and why they achieve the savings is what they do with their PBM contracts. So I think it's important to consider how many states have become more aggressive, particularly, and think sometimes that a carve-out is the best way to do this, but to really constrain spread pricing and to make sure that savings are passed on to the program and to consumers by really, really strengthening those PBM contracts and making sure that there's a pass-through of savings. So that's one provision. The other Medicaid-related provision, which New York's been the lead on, and Massachusetts has followed and others are interested in, is the negotiation for supplemental rebates to try to get particularly very high-cost drugs to come down beyond the point of budget. And I think New York's the model there. Other states don't have the infrastructure to do it, but there's considerable interest. Around the country, most of the focus and most of the work of our drug pricing center has been around the commercial market, recognizing that employers have seen astronomical increases in their drug spend, even more than the numbers that Joel and Beth showed us. So that's been where the focus is. And we've seen virtually every state over the past couple of years introducing various bills to take on pharmaceutical prices. A number of states, 6 states have passed importation from Canada. The federal government has regulated that to enable that. A number of states have done transparency. Maryland tried price gouging. From all that work, we have learned a couple of lessons and have proposed a series of new models going forward and have considerable state interest. One would basically say, it would basically accept that states are at a tough budget crunch at the moment. And so whether they have the capacity to take on the infrastructure of the New York Drug Affordability Review function or the full-blown importation is a question. So why not pivot? And so where we are proposing one piece of legislation that would index what payers, commercial payers in a state pay to Canadian prices, to set an upper payment limit set on international prices. So instead of importing drugs from Canada, import the prices. And you can't import biologics. So this is a way to also extend those savings to biologics. Another model is to build on the work that New York's Medicaid program uses with the Institute of Clinical and Economic Research, ICER. Each year they establish a very credible report that shows a list of drugs unsupported, whose price increase is unsupported by clinical evidence. And they show what those prices are. And this model would basically say to a drug manufacturer who wanted to price at those unsupported prices, that they would pay a tax for the differential between the price and the unsupported price index. So a bunch of models that we think will go forward in the next legislative session.
Great. Those are some definitely interesting models to take a look at. So I'm going to ask Joel, in recent years, a number of states such as Michigan have considered and ultimately did not move forward with implementing a carve-out model, and other states are looking at it, today. Can you provide any insights into reasons why states may have rejected a carve-out model and decided to keep the benefit carved into managed care?
Sure. I think the numbers that we've put forth are are factual and comprehensive, and those are a major reason not to go there. Another thing I didn't mention when I was talking about the programmatic aspects of this, but taking something as central to our healthcare is the drug benefit, and just moving it into a fiscal silo over here outside of your integrated data at the MCO is programmatically weakening your system of care and coverage, and it's just a question of how much weaker it's going to get. You can't match up to that in a carve out programmatically, so it's a dampener that way as well. But so the fiscals are what they are. I would say West Virginia is the one state that has moved where you can look in recent years at what's happened, and the state's consultant has come out with a report saying that it has saved money. Our looks at the data are finding the state's methodology did not look at the net cost per prescription. They did a repricing methodology that artfully avoided looking at what I think is the very most telling statistic, which is at the end of the day, what was your cost per prescription? And in West Virginia, their cost per prescription, 2016, the last pre-carve-out year, to 2019, went up 22 percentage points. The USA went up 11 percentage points. I'm absolutely convinced with evidence that West Virginia did not save money, that they lost money with the carve-out. But those things all compound in other states' thinking as to why they haven't moved in this direction.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to a topic that is around drug price transparency, and including things like requiring manufacturers to reporting on drug price increases, reporting on increases in specific drugs or drug classes, and providing notice on proposed increases. Are there approaches that New York should be considering on sort of what the right transparency is for drugs? And so I'm first going to turn to Dan and Beth, and maybe Dan first. Like, what does transparency actually mean to a consumer or constituency? What do you think they are looking for in terms of drug transparency?
Yeah, first I want to add to what Trish said is that regarding PBMs is that New York State did make some progress on PBMs last year, and they continue to make progress. But more importantly, transparency is that people need, to add on what I mentioned before, transparency means predictability in the market. If there are safeguards in place to allow that stop these companies from suddenly raising their prices like we've seen in the past drastically overnight. And for instance, I've introduced two bills this past session, which were making progress, but unfortunately COVID kind of upended the legislative session last year. One would require pharmaceutical companies to report how often and why they're raising their prescriptions, their cost of medication. Also, the second bill was if a pharmaceutical company wanted to raise their price 10%, they would need to give a 60-day heads up notice to the state. And what would really require that is that it would allow my constituents, the consumer, to know if an increase was coming, but also it would bring transparency to, which means that they couldn't get away with these sudden surcharges and drastic price gougings of these medications like we saw with the EpiPen a few years ago. All of a sudden, people all over the country were hitting with these drastic charges that were unexpected. This would shine light onto that, and which would be, I think, a deterrent for them to drastically raise their prices overnight.
Beth, and for your constituents, what does drug price transparency mean to them?
But first, it means a lot of things. So I do want to, I want to back up to last season because in the budget last year, there was passed Department of Financial Services Drug Accountability Board, and it is coming into being. It should be announced very shortly. This was proposed by the governor, and as I said, it was passed in the budget last year. And this would put a new section into the insurance law to allow the superintendent of financial services to investigate when a prescription drug has increased more than 100% within 1 year time period. And it also provides the superintendent the power of subpoena, as well as imposing a civil penalty and injunction to restrain the violation. So this is pretty exciting. I realize 100% is a kind of a higher bar, but in any case, it's certainly a huge step in the right direction. And just full disclosure, I've been asked to serve on that drug disclosure board, so I'm looking forward to it. I might have let the cat out of the bag because the announcement of the appointments has been done yet. I've been approached to serve on the board of probably. And then on top of that, I guess looking at national and what's happening down there, and U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, many of you may know, issued a drug transparency regulation requiring companies to disclose prices on their TV ads for a 30-day supply of any prescription drug that costs more than $35 a month, which AARP felt was a huge step in the right direction. Of course, several drug manufacturers sued HHS, and a U.S. District Court judge struck down the regulation last summer, saying that Congress really hadn't given HHS the authority for that. We're still very supportive of it. The AARP Foundation says that under the current system, consumers do not get the essential drug pricing information that they need to allow them and their healthcare providers to make the best decisions for their care. So we're going to keep fighting the good fight on that. And then back to the state approach. There was a bill that Senator Biaggi worked on, pay to delay. I think everyone here knows about the pay to delay deals and how that works. And this legislation would require that brand name manufacturers enter into an agreement with a generic manufacturer to delay the release of a more affordable version. So basically, they're paying the generics not to put it on the market, to delay putting it on the market. I think that's pretty abhorrent. And so we're hoping that something happens with that. California has got a pay to delay that was put into place, and the court has so far upheld it in California. So we're looking at that in a very encouraging manner. So I think you'll be hearing more about that in the next leg season coming up.
Thanks, Beth. I'm going to ask, kind of switch a little bit and maybe tee up a question to Trish. In absence of state legislation, are there other approaches that the marketplace, including health plans, providers, employers, may want to consider to help address this rising drug cost?
Please, 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 especially since all these legislative initiatives are very important. They'll inform the federal debate, they create education, but they will be, every one of them will be land in court. It's the nature of pharma, big pharma. I think the kinds of strategies that plans can think about is to sort of think about that PBM contract. Where is there spread pricing? How do we make sure that's transparent and that the money flows? The other way we've seen some really considerable data is around waste-free formularies. The notion, and there's been some pretty great success in a couple of states on sort of looking at formularies and recognizing that what happens is frequently two drugs that are over-the-counter drugs that may cost $3 put together in a new fancy brand name that you can, prescribe and maybe you only have to take once a day for $1,500. And Johns Hopkins has done some terrific work on this, has a document where you can look at what these wasteful drugs are. It's often, over-the-counter drugs things that you can buy over the counter that have been combined. They may be changes in how drugs are taken. Instead of taking it twice a day, you take it once a day, but for an extraordinarily higher cost. And I think those are the kinds of strategies that do show real savings.
While I have you, Trish, I just wanted to ask if you have any thoughts on a recent Maryland attempting to legislate price gouging that was actually struck down as not constitutional, and whether there's other approaches that a state could take to achieve maybe a similar goal.
I think the price gouging bill in Maryland, we worked closely with the Assistant Attorney General who represented that case in court. There are many who think that the court overstepped its interpretation, but we've designed a new price gouging bill that basically takes into account the problems with that Maryland bill. One was that it wasn't clear, it triggered the Dormant Commerce Clause because it wasn't clear that it covered just the state of Maryland. So we made that change. The other was it was unclear about what its scope was and what an egregious price increase would be. And our model takes that into account too. So I think it is absolutely a price gouging bill that would pass. We had a great group of legal experts helping us. And I think it's a stronger bill that would pass legal muster. So I think that's a significant step. The other is to look at, drug affordability review boards take a lot of heavy lifting. But I think you also could take a look at this international pricing index model where you basically say, we're not going to set prices. We can't do that. You provoke patent challenges there. But we can say that as payers of health benefits, we set rates for everything we pay for, hospitals, physicians, every piece of the health sector, we set rates, except drugs. And in drugs, we pay whatever the industry asks us to pay. So in this international payment index notion, you set a limit to what payers will pay for coverage in your state, and penalize manufacturers if they won't provide drugs at that cost. And I think that notion of sort of affordability review boards or setting a fixed price for a payment rate that states pay would certainly be challenged, but would be a pretty clean way to approach the issue of payment limits, and would be able to approach both the price gouging legislation addresses generics only, and by setting a payment rate for payers in a state, you can address both brand and generic.
So now I'm going to open this question up to all the panelists, and I'll start with Joel, but we've all just lived through a national election, and at the federal level, what do you see the impacts of a potentially changing administration having on the policies to address prescription drug pricing?
Thanks, Jennifer. I don't have a great lens into, a great predictive lens by any means, but I just want to echo what Trish said about sort of determining prices rather than just, I've been in DC since 1980 or so, and we learned that paying in Medicaid or Medicare on the basis of what providers are charging is a losing battle. And so we have DRGs in hospital care, we have a fee schedule for physicians, and on and on. And we honestly don't care in Medicaid or Medicare what providers charge anymore. We've determined super well researched reasonable payment amounts that are profitable and viable for the most. Medicaid, maybe not so much, but at least it honors the fact that it's a safety net program, and we're not getting gouged there. But with pharmacy, what they charge is what we pay, and that's just not the place to be. And there's enormous legal barriers to, overcoming that. But I think that's the long-term solution here, is a fee schedule of some ilk for drugs that's equally thoroughly researched as to what's gone on with DRGs and the CPT codes and so forth.
Great, thank you. So any of our other panelists want to provide any guessing or insight on, what may happen from a federal perspective that could impact states?
I guess going back to thinking about the negotiation, allowing them to negotiate. And last year the House did pass a bill. It didn't go anywhere after that. And so we're hoping that with the new administration in, there are other ways to do workarounds to make sure that you can get that that ability to negotiate. It just seems crazy.
Yeah, I would add that I think it will be very challenging for the new administration, given all that will befall them and the fact that we're still amidst this pandemic, and getting vaccines out will make it very tough to take on some of these issues immediately. But I think President-elect Biden has spoken pretty eloquently to his interest in negotiating Medicare rates. If that happened, states could just they could use the same model we've created for an upper payment limit and trigger to Medicare rates to expand that to other states. And I think that has great promise. I think with the Biden administration, we'll see CMMI open to different kinds of approaches from states to take on this issue. And I think in the COVID space itself, there's been such an enormous investment of federal dollars in Operation Warp Speed and the investment in these vaccines. There's such interest in the treatments now and in the future for COVID. There will be, I think this will really focus attention on the costs of these drugs. And I think in a Biden administration, you'll see much more pressure for accountability for that drug development that has been paid for with federal money to make sure costs are reasonable.
So Daniel, I'll give you the last word on a question from the federal level.
I'll just speak from a political point. I think the President-elect Biden, throughout his campaign, there's a few platforms that every rally he would say, and one of those, from climate justice, but one thing he always mentioned was healthcare. And I think if you look at candidates throughout the country, all Democratic candidates, even some Republican candidates at the end of the last campaign spoke about healthcare. And I think we are at that tipping point where something does need to be addressed. So I'm a little bit more, we'll see what Congress looks like when they're sworn in, and there's still a big question mark what the Senate's going to look like. But I think there is a growing political pressure to address some of these affordable, accessible issues. And I think the Biden campaign and now the Biden transition team has made it very clear they want to put that as a priority. And I think the voters are requiring them to do that. The entire 28 midterm cycle was run on healthcare. And I think we're at a tipping point right now.
So I'm going to actually open the Q&A box. There's a couple of questions that have come in. They're a little lengthy, so I'm going to actually try and summarize. I have a question that's come in from John Meyer, and it's related to manufacturers have copay and patient assistant programs. Sometimes they're called drug coupon programs. And there's current regulations that don't allow beneficiaries who are covered by Medicare and Medicaid to apply those coupons. Is there any thoughts by this panel on modifications to that legislation or other ideas around how manufacturers' consumer programs could be applied to government assistance? So maybe Trish, I'll start with you with that.
Yeah, I think there's more interest in states in how you could expand those Medicare and Medicaid protections to the private sector. And I think the challenge, and the Assemblyman will better speak to this, the challenge is coupons are bad policy in that they have inflationary impacts on the cost of drugs. Somebody pays for them. It gets people on a drug that may not be on their formulary. It has all kinds of challenging influences on rising costs, but they are profoundly important to consumers. And the consumer doesn't think about the system. The consumer thinks about their Humira will cost $25 instead of $25,000. So I think the challenge is for states, how do you do something about coupons without giving consumers the same kind of relief?
Daniel, any thoughts on consumers approaching to coupons and?
No.
That's why we can't pass this law. It's true, it's hard.
It's a good point.
Great. So there's a second question in the chat, and it's a little bit lengthy, but I'm going to try and summarize. It's really trying to draw a parallel between 340B programs and the role of the local pharmacy and actually ultimately the purchaser of the drugs. So the question I think is trying to get at, is there any idea to be pursued that extends 340B framework beyond safety net and into other elements of government purchasing? So I'm gonna maybe ask Joel. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the 340B program and its applicability in any in expanding or contracting.
Yeah, I'm not sure, what, again, there's a lot of legal issues in terms of extending those favorable pricing, same with Department of Defense, drug prices and so on. There's niches, 340B being one of them, where there's particularly favorable pricing going on. And so there's, of course, interest in moving and expanding the use of that favorable pricing outside of the restrictions that they're in right now. I don't see a path to that, readily available to policymakers right now. But the 340B has been a component of the carve-out debates in many states in recent years, and there may be, I think New York did a good job on the 340B of presenting what they thought they could save and how, but and it was a lot of money. But I'm concerned that that's sort of an axe on safety net providers. If you do save the money there, you're wielding an axe on the safety net providers who can least afford to take that hit and fulfill their mission. So there's also a lot of 340B policy issues just within the current bubble, particularly as related to carve-out dynamics.
And I would argue that there are already so many loopholes in the 340B program that it has lost its safety net focus, that particularly in an era of, we do a lot of work about hospital costs. In an era of hospital consolidation, you see big hospital systems buying up safety net entities and then using the 340B program in ways that generate revenue for the hospital, not its intent. So I think there are some real important reasons to look carefully at the 340B program, what its intent is, and whether it's really being used fully to create lower cost drugs for low income consumers and the safety net that provides them. And I think there's considerable evidence to suggest it's been creatively used by those who arguably are not the safety net.
So there's another question that came in from the chat that kind of brings us back to the sort of the federal level, which is, do we expect a divided Congress and Senate to address broad efforts on drug prices or cost? Or, given the narrow majorities, do we expect more sort of modest compromise? And I think Daniel's smiling the largest, so I'm going to ask him to respond.
I try to be optimistic, but I think the House majority is very slim, and the Senate, we don't, it's going to be close to at least, but we don't know who's going to be in charge yet. So I think, again, I back to the same point what I mentioned before, is that there's that tipping point right now where there's a lot of pressure to correct some of these things, and the current situation isn't tenable. So it's definitely going to be difficult to see a path where there's broad sweeping reform over the next 2 years. And I also want to add before, I know local pharmacies was mentioned in the previous question, but what we're seeing in New York is that a lot of these PBMs have really destroyed our local pharmacies, the small and pop pharmacies, because they're squeezing every single nickel and dime out of them. Some of them have told me that once they add the water into making their own medicine, they lose all their profit right there, because those PBMs have squeezed so much out of our local pharmacy infrastructure. But yeah, back to the other. But this question is, I think it's hard to see any broad change in reform, but hopefully we'll make some small progress.
Beth, anything to add to sort of this sort of balance of power between the two regulatory bodies?
That's why we have states. The laboratories of innovation and to show the federal government the way. And there's a long history of it. I mean, this children's health insurance program was passed in states, 26 states before the Congress did. And the ACA itself, most of the provisions of the ACA were passed in many states before that was enacted. So I think that's why states are fun.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of the panelists today for all your contributions and your perspectives. I do think that this is something we're all very interested in getting right and helping consumers afford prescription drugs. And I thank everyone who submitted questions into the Q&A. So thank you for your time this morning and your ideas and passion. So I'll hand it back to Eric, who I think is going to lead us into the next, part of the wonderful conference.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks for taking the time to moderate this session. Assemblyman, great to have you coming back next year. We look forward to continuing to work with you on these important issues. And for Joel, Beth, and Trish, really appreciate the perspective you all bring from a number of different aspects. So thank you all for taking the time today. This was a great discussion. So we've given you a little bit of extra time during the break. We're going to come back at 12:45 for our next session, which is looking at how we're maintaining momentum on payment reform in the midst of the pandemic. In the meantime, as a reminder to folks, if you're having any issues opening up particular features, particularly the gaming challenge, and we know there's a lot of interest there, just make sure to refresh your computer, or Ryan is always available at the live help desk. So with that, thank you all again. We'll be back at 12:45 for our next session, and we look forward to that conversation.